With pine wilt working its way further into the state, homeowners are concerned that their evergreens may contract the disease. It's important to note that pine wilt is fairly host specific. This means that it only attacks specific species of pine trees. It will not attack evergreens such as spruce, concolor or white fir, juniper, arborvitae. Of the pine species, it mainly is attacking Scotch or Scots pine. We do know that white pine and Austrian pine are also slightly susceptible, and that ponderosa pine is not susceptible. So if you're concerned about your evergreen and if it can contract pine wilt, it's important to know if you have a pine and which pine species that it is. Okay, it's fairly easy to tell pines from other evergreens. It's been my experience that if people see an evergreen that's growing that has needles and it has cones, they call it a pine tree, but this is not always the case. To distinguish a pine tree, you need to look closely at the needles where they're attached to the twig, and pine needles will always grow in bundles of 2 to 5. Other needle-like evergreens will grow singly on the stem. Scotch pine or Scots pine, which is highly susceptible to pine wilt, has 2 needles per bundle, and these needles are about 1.5 to 3 inches long. Another identifying characteristic is if you look at the trunk of the tree, it'll have an orangish or coppery cast to it. This is very distinctive higher up on the trunk of the tree. The pine cone of a Scotch pine is about 1.5 to 3 inches long. Now Austrian pine, which is slightly susceptible to pine wilt, also has 2 needles per bundle, but these needles are anywhere from 3 to 6 inches long, and they're fairly straight. The pine cone itself is about 2 to 3 inches long. Ponderosa pine will have 2 needles per bundle and 3 needles per bundle, so you need to look at a few more needles to determine if there are 3 needles per bundle as well as the 2 needles per bundle. Ponderosa pine needles are about 5 to 6 inches long, sometimes longer, and they're slightly twisted. The pine cone of ponderosa pine can be anywhere from 3 to 6 inches long, and the base of the scales on the cone will have kind of a sharp spine. Austrian pine cones will not have that spine. White pine, which is slightly susceptible to pine wilt, has 5 needles per bundle, so it's pretty difficult to mistake it for the Scotch pine. And there's 5 needles per bundle. They're very soft. White pine is a very soft pine, so it doesn't feel prickly or pokey. The other identifying characteristic, if you have it available, is the pine cone. The cones of white pine are about 5 to 6 inches long and only about 1.5 inches across. Now there's one more pine that also grows in Nebraska that has 2 needles per bundle, and this is a jack pine. At this time, it is not known that jack pine is susceptible to pine wilt, but jack pine has 2 needles per bundle, but the needles are only about 3/4 to 1.5 inches long, so they're quite short. So as you can see, even though these are the 4 most common pines we have in Nebraska, it is fairly easy to distinguish them if you keep these characteristics in mind. Again, the Scotch pine, 2 needles per bundle, they're about 1.5 to 3 inches long. The pine cone itself is about 2 to 3 inches long, but if you look up at the bark on an older tree in the upper part of the trunk, it will be an orangish cast to it, and that will help you to identify whether you have a Scotch pine versus one of the other 3.